So, es ist 7 Uhr. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie heute Abend hierher gekommen sind. We're very happy to have you all here this evening. And the Admiral Nimitz, I'm Mike Hagee. I'm the CEO and president of the Admiral Nimitz Foundation. Most of you know that you're here in the historic Ballroom. One point on that. We spent about a year taking this back to the way it looked when my generation grew up here, but it looks exactly the way it does or did when Admiral Nimitz was here for the last time on the 13th of October, 1945. And the team here did a great job on that. We're happy to host this last in the series from the 175th Committee on Germans and Comanches in Fredericksburg. The Gillespie County Historical Society has hosted the other 4 up at the sanctuary, but they had Lensfest today, so we're happy to substitute for them. And I think there's really an important connection here. Admiral Nimitz's father figure was his grandfather because, as most of you know, his father died before he was born. And when those 120 Germans came from New Braunfels on the 8th of May, 1846, there was a young 19-year-old German former merchant who came with them, and that was Admiral Nimitz's grandfather. So he was here on day one. He was a little bit younger than Moisebach, but Moisebach and Nimitz's grandfather became very good, close friends. And even though Nimitz lived here, Admiral Nimitz lived here for the first 6 years of his life, as most of you know, he moved to that other town up down south, and Kerrville, and actually worked in the hotel there, the St. Charles. But what Moisebach did, and you'll learn a little bit about it tonight, as far as the treaties and the treaty that was signed, and the way it's the only treaty that was signed between Native Americans and in this particular case, the German Immigration Company, the only treaty not broken by either side. And I personally believe there's a reason for that, and that is because Moisebach looked at people as human beings. And he didn't look at their color or their race or their background or anything else, as human beings. And I think that was passed on to Nimitz's grandfather, and it was actually passed on to Nimitz. And much of his success, in my opinion, was because of that. But we have some experts to talk about this tonight. We have their book back here on this particular subject tonight. I've read it. I strongly recommend it. It's a great book if you're interested in the Germans and Comanches here during that period of time. But this is a 175th commemoration function, and so I would like to introduce a good friend of mine, Herr Dr. David Shields, the executive director of the Gillespie County Historical Society. David.
Thank you very much, General. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here again. I think I recognize many faces now. This has been a great year to get to know so many of you in this very special year. And so I was thinking about what would be a nice way to introduce these very two esteemed authors and people from academia. And I think the best way for you all just to understand a little bit about their pedigrees, to take a look at what was handed out to you. Do most of you get that when you came in? It gives you a good sense of these individuals, these professionals who've committed their adult lives, their professional life, to better understanding this topic. And their ability to convey that to us enlightens that entire topic. And what's amazing, whether it was my time here, when I had the good fortune of working here for a couple of years, we studied the period of time of World War II, this country fighting the war and the servicemen and women overseas. But what all of history does, it connects us. It makes it relative. You find irrelevant. You realize how much we're all the same, how in the same circumstances we're compelled to do so many different things. But the story that these two gentlemen are going to share with you is inspiring because Moisabek and Santa Ana and the Penatuka Comanches in this area seem to have responded differently, a little bit differently. And the general just mentioned that to you, of all the treaties that were signed over a 250-year period in the early development of North America with the Europeans coming here, that one stands alone, and that really makes it special for all of us. But I want to go over just to the podium for a moment. Well, maybe I can do it. Maybe I can be balanced enough. I'm not standing over that scary well. And I learned I'm not the only one that kind of walks around it. I mean, I don't know. My brain is saying, I don't know. But so let me see if I can do this. I've got is a couple of interesting things to share about these two gentlemen, rather than the things that you have in front of you. And I'd like to start off with the fact that both of them are going to be taking turns, and they may converse amongst them. And Professor Wickham will begin, but I'll start with Professor Gelo. In 1982, during Dan's first summer of living with his adoptive Comanche family, the small house became very overcrowded as relatives moved in together. There were 5 generations living under one roof, from one of the oldest living Comanches, a 94-year-old woman, to her great-great-grandson, age 4. It was a wonderful opportunity for Dan to learn about Comanche family customs. Like many tribal people, the Comanches do not have words for great-great-grandmother or great-great-grandson. Because in the old days, inheritance was not important, and lifespans were so short that such terms were not needed. Instead, the matriarch and little boy addressed each other as older sister and younger brother, a very endearing acknowledgement of their relationship. With the house so crowded, Dan decided for sake white man's privacy, as one of the occupants called it, and he gave up his morning shaving ritual. Soon he had a decent beard, and soon his host began calling him, let me get this right, Motsotaibo? Motsotaibo, that's Comanche for sure. I'll see if I get it right the next time. Bearded white man. They explained that this was a humorous reference to an old Comanche song and story about the first time the Indians saw men with beards. Recently, as Dan and Chris were studying the diaries of German settlers, they found that the Comanche called the German beardmen the undoubtedly a translation of the Motsotaibo term. Research careers have a funny way of coming full circle. That's a great story. You didn't say where you stopped shaving. Sorry, is that inappropriate in this area? Underarms? I don't know. Okay. Professor Wickham. Let me share just a brief little introduction on Professor Wickham. 4 years ago, when he was teaching German at UTSA, Chris received an email out of the blue from a German musician and songwriter asking if Chris would arrange for him to perform for students at UTSA. As it turned out, the timing was wrong and the performance didn't work out. The musician had been an exchange student at New Braunfels High School years before and was intrigued by the Texan song. Oh, let me see. Wait a minute. You're going to be upset. Let me see if I can do this. Texanische Lieder. Texanische Lieder. You just have to put the accent in it, right? And it always works when you do that part. By German poet Heinrich Hoffmann von Fallersleben, who had written the German anthem Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. He didn't know Chris had published a German singer-songwriter, nor that Chris was working on German migration to Texas in his research. Instead of a performance for UTA students, they met for lunch, and with each passing mouthful, the depth of their mutual interest became apparent. They kept in touch, and the outcome is that they are preparing a musical about German immigration to Texas to be performed at the open-air Luisenberg Theater Festival in Bavaria. The festival director has written the libretto. The musician has set the song text to music, and Chris has provided the background information and been the consultant in Texas. The COVID pandemic has delayed the premiere, but with a little luck, it should take place in 2023. So clearly, when you see these two people speaking with you, the depth of their experience, the scope of their experiences is all tied into this and creates a sincere and genuine experience. So I would like at this time to introduce Chris, Professor Wickham, to begin our discussion.
Thank you, David. I have a mic here, so.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction and for the great welcome we've received here in Fredericksburg. It's a great privilege to deliver in this wonderful surrounding. Our presentation today is based on research conducted for our book, Comanches and Germans on the Texas Frontier, the Ethnology of Heinrich Berghaus, published by Texas A&M University Press. We will discuss in detail a German article from 1851 that Dan Gelo became aware of in his work on Comanche linguistics. We have translated the article into English and give an extensive discussion of the genesis and contents of the article in the context of German social history and emigration, particularly to Texas, and of the development of anthropology, Plains Indian, and specifically Comanche studies in the US. One focus of our investigation is the relations between German settlers in the Fredericksburg area with the Comanches at the time of the 1847 Non-Aggression Pact, known as the Moisebach Treaty or the Comanche Treaty, which will be in town here next weekend for you to see in person. An underexplored outcome of this private treaty between the Penatucket Band of the Comanche tribe and the German immigrants is an agreement that a member of the German settlers community would go to live with the Comanches as a kind of guarantor of good faith. The man who undertook this task proved to be an extremely important source of information for subsequent scholarship, though his contribution was long ignored. Dr. Gelo will talk in a few minutes about the Comanche dictionary this man compiled, about the original map he provided locating Comanche camps and grazing ranges, and about the cultural information concerning the Comanche that he recorded and passed along. But first, I will offer some background on the man and his story. He was one of the Germans who arrived in Texas with the Adelsverein project. The Adelsverein, or Verein zum Schutz deutscher Einwanderer in Texas, the Society of Noblemen for the Protection of German Immigrants to Texas, consisted of a group of 21 noblemen and one woman who in 1842 formed a society to promote emigration of Germans to Texas. The terms were attractive. Emigrants were offered transportation, land, schools, medical care, and support until the first harvest. In all, the Adelsverein brought about 8,000 Germans to Texas. The Germans arriving in Texas with the Adelsverein project in the mid-1840s were not unaware of potential dangers arising from contact with Indians. The Germans who had previously founded Texas settlements in the 1830s in Cat Spring, Mill Creek, and in the industry area had Indian stories to tell. The German botanist Ferdinand Lindheimer, who had arrived in 1836 and a decade later cooperated with the first Adelsverein administrators, had developed close contacts with native individuals and bands as he moved through their lands collecting plants for scholars in New England. And the first Commissioner General of the Adelsverein in Texas, Prince Karl von Solms-Braunfels, entered an agreement with the Lipan Apache at New Braunfels within his first months in Texas. The Indian problem, in the eyes of the arriving Germans, was one to be managed by negotiation, cooperation, and good faith. The text of the Moisebach Treaty between the Penatucket Comanche and the German settlers makes no reference to having a German live with the Comanche. So that agreement must have been oral. In native cultures, this kind of arrangement was not unusual, but to the Germans it was not an attractive proposition. And at first there were no volunteers. The man who eventually, reluctantly, came forward to play the key role as German representative in the camp of Comanche headman Santa Anna, following the signing of the 1847 treaty, was 25-year-old Emil Krivitz. I'm sorry I don't have a picture of him at age 25, but that is Emil. Little is known of Krivitz's life prior to his travels to Texas. Indications are that he was born into the nobility on January 18th, 1822, at Kloster Zinna near Jüterburg in present-day Brandenburg. His full name is recorded as Baron Emil von Krivitz de Chepri. We don't have much information about his education, though some letters to the Adelsverein from August and September of 1845 that have survived in transcript show that he signed himself Krivitz Forstkandidat. So we may assume that at least 3 years of professional training in forestry after successful completion of a secondary education. We conclude additionally from the materials that he supplied to geographer Heinrich Berghaus, who published them in 1850 and 1851, that he was a man of acute curiosity, perceptive in his observations, experienced in writing, and with an aptitude for language study. Krivitz came to Texas through the settlement project of the Adelsverein. Records have him arriving in Galveston on the bark Franziska from Bremen on or before February 5th, 1846. In December 1845, that is, during Krivitz's crossing, Texas, in accordance with the July 1845 agreement, became part of the United States after almost 10 years as an independent republic. When he arrived at Indianola on the Gulf Coast, Krivitz enlisted and served briefly in the U.S. Army in its war with Mexico. After his discharge and return to Indianola about 3 months later, that would be in August, Krivitz was hired by the Adelsverein to provide protection for the party of John O. Moisebach, the second Commissioner General of the Adelsverein Affairs in Texas. Moisebach's expedition was preparing to leave New Braunfels to negotiate peace with the Comanches. They were heading to the Fisher-Miller land grant north of the Llano River, about 115 miles away, where the Adelsverein had contracted to place settlers. Krivitz arrived in New Braunfels after Moisebach had left and only caught up with Moisebach's party after the March 2nd, 1847 negotiations on the San Saba River had been completed with the Penatucket Comanche headmen Santa Anna, Buffalo Hump, and Old Owl. Krivitz was then assigned to protect Richard Austin Howard, who was to survey the grant lands. The assignment to protect Howard is key to Krivitz being in the right place at the right time to compile his German Comanche dictionary. The initial agreements made between the Comanche chiefs and Moisebach at the San Saba River in March were to be confirmed and ratified at a second meeting to be held 2 months later. The Non-Aggression Pact, which protected German surveyors and settlers moving into the Fisher-Miller Grant against Comanche predations, and in turn offered German support to the Comanches against their enemies. And it was just thus sealed in Fredericksburg with celebrations and gifts from the Germans to the Comanches on May 9th, 1847. For the next 4 months, Krivitz resided in Santa Anna's camp and experienced and observed Comanche life firsthand and gathered the data that became his dictionary. By and large, the relationship between Krivitz and Chief Santa Anna was one of trust and good faith, even though the circumstances suggest hostage rather than guest status. It's likely that much, and perhaps all, of the lexical information that went into the dictionary came from Santa Anna himself, who, according to Krivitz, spoke Spanish and a little English. How can we best characterize Krivitz's accomplishment as a linguist. His dictionary was published in a yearbook that served as a supplement to Heinrich Berghaus's very influential physical atlas, Physikalischer Atlas, that was released in several volumes by the publisher Justus Perthes beginning in 1846. This 1851 supplement, titled Geographisches Jahrbuch, included an article authored by Berghaus titled Über die Verwandtschaft der Shoshonen, Comanchen und Apachen nebst einer Karte vom Jagdgebiet der Comanchen in Texas. On the relationship of the Shoshones, Comanches, and Apaches, including a map of the Comanche hunting grounds in Texas. At the heart of Berghaus's argument in support of the now generally accepted theory that the Comanches were descended from the Shoshones was the linguistic data provided by Crivitz. Though Berghaus does not mention Crivitz by name in the 1851 article, there is no doubt that the dictionary originated from Crivitz. The list consists of 366 Comanche words, grouped loosely according to semantic fields, along with their German translations. This word list, glossary, is not organized in a rigorously systematic way, but it does follow some structural principles. German words and some phrases are listed first, followed by the corresponding Comanche expression. German nouns make up the largest subset of words. There are 280 of them, followed by 50 verbs, 10 adjectives, 15 interactive commands and phrases, and 6 pronouns. We do not know what Crivitz's motivations were in making the list. Perhaps his work was driven by his own curiosity. Perhaps it was to relieve boredom and occupy his mind during his sojourn with the natives. Perhaps it came from a suggestion by Santa Anna. There is no evidence that this was an assignment given to him by Moisebach, Berghaus, or anybody else. Nor is there evidence that the list was circulated among the German settlers in Texas afterward to aid communication with the Comanches. We do not even know how it came from Crivitz into Berghaus' possession. We do know that other material included in Berghaus' 1851 article had already been published by Berghaus during the previous year, and at that time was attributed explicitly to Crivitz. This is the set of cultural observations and ethnographic notes that describe Comanche life. Sitten und Gebräuche der Comanches in Texas, customs and practices of the Comanches in Texas. The headings used to organize the cultural information are religion, hunting and war, body adornment and clothing, weapons, saddles and tack, huts, mourning the dead, games, dance, music, lifestyle, chiefs, polygyny, adultery and marriage, in that order, interestingly, and activities of women. Dan will say more about these cultural notes. How did Berghaus come into possession of Crivitz's Comanche dictionary and the cultural notes that he, Berghaus, published in 1851? We can only speculate, based on the content of Crivitz's contribution to the Berghaus article, the specifics, insofar as we know them, of his personal story, and the chronology of the historical context. Crivitz himself makes reference to a visit he made to Germany after his stay with the Comanches. When was this return to Europe, after which Crivitz clearly came back to Texas? It was almost certainly between late 1847 and April 1851. We know that in late 1847 he was conducting Adelsverein settlers to the Llano to found colonies there, including Castell, which still exists today. At this time, he also signed the petition to establish Gillespie County. And in April 1851, Berghaus was corresponding with Wilhelm Perthes, the publisher of the Jahrbuch, about Crivitz's contribution to his article. The Perthes Collection Archive in the Universitäts- und Forschungsbibliothek Erfurt-Gotha holds a letter dated April 20th, 1851, which is clearly Berghaus's cover letter as he submits the article and the accompanying map to Perthes for publication, as you can clearly see. It appears from comments Berghaus makes in the endnotes to his 1851 article that he discussed some of the contents with Crivitz in person. In endnote 13, for example, he remarks, and I quote, "I must note that my informant was not sufficiently familiar with the ethnography of the rest of North America to know anything about the existence of the Shoshones." End of quote. This suggests that Berghaus had attempted to follow up with questions to his informant about the Shoshones, and while it is possible that this was done through correspondence, the more likely answer is that at least one conversation took place between them. Two other references in Berghaus's endnotes provide information about their communication. The clearest is the indication in endnote 16 that Berghaus had already published Crivitz's notes on Comanche culture in 1850. It's likely that these cultural notes were received first, and that could explain why they were published separately. No mention is made of any Comanche glossary or word list in the 1850 publication of the cultural notes, and given Berghaus's evident excitement at having possession of it and of his lifelong tendency to publish every new discovery quickly, we suppose that he had the cultural notes in his possession first and that the dictionary followed. The second endnote reference that reflects on the Crivitz-Berghaus communication is the long quotation in endnote 11 from Crivitz's letter to his mother, dated February 14th, 1847. Written in Fredericksburg, the letter states that in 2 days, Crivitz will be heading into Indian territory. Though he does not say it, we know that this refers to his journey to catch up with Moisebach, who is laying the groundwork for the treaty with the Comanches that will later necessitate Crivitz's stay in Chief Santa Anna's village. This document, therefore, predates the glossary by 7 months or so. Did Crivitz's mother live in Potsdam, where Berghaus worked, or have connections there to pass the letter along to Berghaus? Firm answers to the question of how Berghaus acquired Crivitz's dictionary and cultural notes are elusive at the present time. Nevertheless, the substantive value of Berghaus's article and Crivitz's Comanche dictionary, map, and cultural observations as contributions to our awareness of the German-Comanche relations and as documents of Comanche ethnology is beyond doubt. And for this reason, they merit close evaluation in the context of the development of linguistics and anthropological science in the United States and elsewhere. Dr. Gelo will talk about this now.
Thank you, Chris. This segment will highlight the linguistic and ethnographic value of the Berghaus article for Comanche studies. These interpretations are informed by 40 years' experience in archival study and field research with contemporary Comanche people in southwest Oklahoma. Chris and I are gratified that Berghaus and Crivitz's work is not only of interest to academics, but it's also helpful to the Numina, the people as the Comanches call themselves, as they strive to keep alive their native language and the traditional knowledge that makes them a distinctive culture. First, let's look at the overarching issue of Berghaus's contributions to the classification of Numic or Shoshonean languages. Numic, the term derived from Numina, the Comanches' word for themselves, also called Shoshonean languages. This question was Crivitz's driving concern, and I'm going to show you some slides of linguists of the past, and I want you to step back into the 1850s for a few minutes because these names are not familiar to us today unless we study linguistics, but imagine in the 1850s, as people in Western Europe and North America were just still learning about a large number of cultural groups around the world that were just being, if not discovered, encountered. And what languages did they speak, and how could we write their languages, and how were they related to each other? And of course, the question of linguistic relationship bears on the question of the history of the groups, particularly important when groups don't have long written histories for themselves. The Western intellectuals were trying to reconstruct basically the history of the human race by looking at language. So these people were the sort of rocket scientists of their time. And Berghaus threw himself into that milieu. A sense of urgency hung over the world of Native American language study at the time Berghaus was writing his 1851 article. Knowledge of the Shoshone and neighboring language groups was recent and only formative. In 1824, as the first details of Comanche and Navajo culture were making their way into print in English, the naturalist C.S. Rafinesque lamented that, quote, "The writers have totally neglected to notice the languages of those nations, often the only clue to trace their origin and history," unquote. By 1826, the American statesman and ethnologist Albert Gallatin had set out on a mission to amass Native American vocabularies by sending circulars to traders and missionaries. But by 1846, his effort was no longer funded and had stalled. That year, with his record of Texas languages remaining deficient and his health in irreversible decline, Gallatin wrote to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs imploring that vocabularies be collected from the Comanche and Pawnee delegations then visiting Washington, D.C. But his request went unanswered, his supporters in the federal government having become preoccupied with the outbreak of the Mexican War. Shoshone country had proven a special obstacle. According to one writer, quote, "The attempts to penetrate this region have been attended with suffering and death." Another American linguist, Horatio Hale, did collect successfully in the far west and began discerning relationships among the Shoshonean tongues. But Berghaus was poised to step into the breach with his own important contributions. Berghaus's impact on linguistic research was practically instant. In pursuing connections between Comanche and other languages, he stimulated the delineation of the Uto-Aztecan language family. Now that's a large language group comparable to Indo-European. If you're familiar with the Indo-European language family, all of the languages from India west across Europe are related in an ancient way, and then they diverge into subgroups. And in North America, the Uto-Aztecan group comprises tribes from the Utes up in the Rocky Mountains all the way down to the Aztecs in Mexico. And at a very basic level, those languages are related, and Comanche and Shoshone are part of that. So the delineation of this large language family was done by Berghaus's acquaintance at the Royal Library, the German linguist Johann Karl Eduard Buschmann. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture for Buschmann. In an 1854 scientific report, Buschmann reproduced the Krivitz-Berghaus word list, using it to support his theory of linguistic affiliation. The classification that he came up with was then refined by several scientists: the Mexican philologist Francisco Pimentel, the Swiss-American ethnologist Albert Gatschet, working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or Bureau of American Ethnology, the Smithsonian in Washington, and the American anthropologist and linguist Daniel Brinton at University of Pennsylvania, Alfred Kroeber at Berkeley, Edward Sapir, and Benjamin Whorf, all during the latter 19th and early 20th centuries. Berghaus was in the forefront of this impulse to record and classify Comanche and related languages. And his linguistic contributions are all the more admirable because he was a polymath rather than a specialist. The Krivitz word list informed Berghouse's systematic comparison of Comanche with Shoshone to verify the historical relationship between the two peoples. He presented this exercise in a separate table in the 1851 article. Berghaus does not get into the particulars of the comparison in his article, but the basis for his determination that the two languages are related is obvious from the table that he provides. And we can take a look here. Here are 4 of the terms from his table, and you can clearly see the resemblances between those words, even though their spelling is a little different according to the linguist's choice of how to capture the sounds. Body parts are often a good subject to explore linguistically because those terms typically don't change over a long period of time, so you can see relationships. The first term for ear in Comanche, naki, is ear, but you'll see in Western Shoshone it was recorded as inaki or inaka, and that's simply because in a lot of languages, in a lot of Indian languages, when you ask somebody about a body part, if you say, what do you call this? They don't say ear, they say my ear or your ear. And is your, okay? Inaka, your ear. So somebody said, what do you call this? And he said, your ear, okay? So that's why he wrote it down that way, but it's the same word. And these are the kinds of things that you can discern when you look at the word list. So the table in full contains 55 basic and presumably stable terms from Western Shoshone, the dialect of the small bands ranging from California to Idaho. These terms were taken from Gallatin's 1848 report to the American Ethnological Society. Berghaus was then able to provide 36 matching terms from Krivitz's Comanche list. And here the deficiencies in Krivitz's list become apparent as he gives no Comanche terms for numbers or some other basic concepts, and the Comanche pronouns are confused also. And then there are inaccuracies as well in the Berghaus-Krivitz phonology and transcription when we look at the comparative material. At the same time, a mistake in Gallatin's list is also revealed. He gave the Shoshone word for cloud as rain, and that's revealed when we look at the Comanche in comparison. But despite these imperfections, at least 4 cognate relationships are patently obvious, and several others are perceptible upon closer examination. Now, Berghaus supposed, without any etymologic evidence, but because of more superficial cultural resemblances and overlapping territories, that Apache was also related to Comanche and Shoshone. But this contention was disproven soon after as Apache vocabularies were collected. Apache belongs to a separate language family, the Na-Dene language family, not Uto-Aztecan. The more fundamental contribution is Krivitz and Berghaus's Comanche word list itself, which is the earliest glossary of the language in print, almost. It immediately precedes the published lists collected by Texas Indian agent Robert Neighbors and U.S. Army explorers Randolph Marcy and A.W. Whipple. The German list is not only the first, but also the longest of these early ones with, as Chris mentioned, 366 entries compared to Neighbors' 213 is the next largest. The only work to deny Berghaus' absolute claim to first rights is that of David Burnett, who published a brief vocabulary in the July 3, 1824 Cincinnati Literary Gazette. Burnett, the future first president of the Republic of Texas, had spent the winter of 1818-1819 camped along the Colorado headwaters in close contact with Comanches. Burnett had submitted his list for publication as a direct response to Raffinesque, and it consists of 89 entries. The only other known Comanche vocabulary predating Berghouse's is found in the manuscript that is unpublished notes of the Mexican Comisión de Límites scientific expedition of 1828-1829. The Mexican government sent a scientific expedition into its northern borderlands, including Texas. Apart from these two-word lists, the unpublished and the one published one, the record of Comanche before Berghouse's work consists of a smattering of translated terms, personal names, and number terms here and there in early travelers' accounts, treaty documents, and the then unpublished official records of Spanish New Mexico. To render the vocabulary most useful to modern readers, Dr. Wickham and I have prepared a version which provides English translations to the original German entries. I guess I have dinner on my mind, entries, plus comparisons of Krivitz's Comanche terms with ones from later vocabularies. So since this day, there have been other vocabularies created, even in modern times, and we can refer to those for clarification. This material is arranged in a 5-column table of numbered entries showing the German terms or phrases, our English translations of the German, the Comanche words as published by Berghaus using a German style of sound system, which works pretty well for Comanche, and our comparisons using a modern kind of alphabetic system. The list contains several words not recorded anywhere else. For example, they have a word for gun sight, mawua. They have a word for the swelling of a horse's joint, mamakta. There are numerous animal terms. Chris, if you could please advance. There we go. Just a sample. Animal terms are of special interest not only because of the lifestyle of the Comanches as hunters and pastoralists, but because they have spiritual significance as well. So we see, for example, the word for a paint horse, tosonavo. This means white spotted. It's great, spotted white. Interestingly, the word that they gave Krivitz for bear is recognizable as the Spanish word oso. How did that happen? Well, there's a lot of Spanish in Comanche because of their long interaction with the Spanish. They have a lot of Spanish words that they've adopted, particularly for things from outside their culture that the Spanish introduced. But why for bear? Well, it turns out that the bear is a particularly powerful spiritual animal. And in Comanche culture, it's impolite to use someone's personal name directly in their presence. It's considered impolite. You would address them as a relative rather than use their personal name. So that stands for the powerful animals as well. You wouldn't call the bear by the usual name, Wira or Washape, if you could use a nickname. And so the Comanches had a lot of different nicknames for the bear, Big Paw and Yellow Snout and things like that. And it was meant as a way of being respectful of the bear spirit. And I think in this instance, they just played it safe and gave Krivitz the Spanish name. There were also some mistakes that we detected in Krivitz's word list. One amusing one concerned the word for to braid the hair, haarflechten, which in proper Comanche is kuisakatu. Kuisa means a twist. Katu is to possess a twist, to twist your hair. Kuisakatu. But that's not the word that Krivitz recorded. He recorded posiket, which is recognizable as posivakat. The element kat again, to possess. Posa is craziness, to possess craziness, to be crazy. He gave the word to be crazy for a hair braid. How did that happen? Was it simply a clerical error? Well, we realized after a while, after thinking about this, in Plains Indian Sign Language, which the Comanches were conversant in, to say braid the hair, or a hair braid, is to make a motion with both hands like this, a twisting motion. To say someone is crazy is a twisting motion with one hand like this, almost like, we say in English, a person's twisted. Well, we can imagine Krivitz sitting down with his informant, maybe Santa Anna or someone else, and saying, what do you call that? Meaning the braid, but he did this with one hand instead of two, and he got the word for crazy instead of braid. There was another example like that where he gives the word, he gives the Comanche word for nosebleed, but it literally means whisker pull. So he probably said, what do you call that? And the guy said, pull your whiskers, I guess. I don't know. And he wrote it down. So, when you get into the words, there are a lot of interesting things going on here that help you imagine what the interaction was like between the German elicitor and his informants. So, a third area of contribution is the ethnographic information, as Chris mentioned, in various forms. This includes unmatched detail on band organization and territories. Berghouse's map denotes grazing places, customary camp areas for different headmen during the period. Now, first we can see here he has a prose description of their territories, largely corresponding to the spaces between different streams in the hill country associated with different headmen. And these locations can be matched to other records that we can find, and they're very illuminating. And then the map itself locates a whole host of ethnic groups. Some are Comanche subgroups, some are other tribes. And, neighboring peoples. And these all have important implications when we look at their locations. Who was camped where? What were their relationships? There's a name, for example, the Pohoi. Puhia is how he spells it in his map, P-U-H-E-A. They're up there on the left somewhere. We recognize that as Pohoi, which is the Shoshonean term for sage, the sage people. The sage people was a nickname for Shoshones. And here is rare proof that Shoshone groups came down and camped with their Comanche cousins at certain intervals in the 1800s. So that relationship between the Shoshones and Comanches, where we think the Comanches broke off, they maintained their relationship and visited each other. Berghaus gives 9 Comanche river names, only 3 of which match the more well-known ones promulgated in the maps of Stephen F. Austin and his many imitators. And there is abundant and sometimes novel information on domestic life, marriage, religion, dance, and clothing and adornment. To offer only a few examples, Krivitz describes dances that are different from modern powwow dances. You'll get to see some modern Comanche dances next weekend. The dances that Krivitz describes are entirely different. He records the use of buffalo hair to lengthen human hairstyles. He tells of medicine men using an animal bladder as a bellows to dispense curative smoke. He describes what modern Comanches call a red and blue. In Comanche, ekasukwe, red half. It's a blanket, half red cloth and half blue cloth that men wear over their shoulders in many important ceremonies. It's still in use. And he also describes the red and blue cloth dress, remembered by the elder Comanche woman Nemaduevetsi back in 1933. In an interview, she said, the Penaduka in the southeast were wealthier and wore fancy clothes. The women wore red inserts in the sides of their dresses and had red sleeves. It was very distinctive. Such a dress was painted by Friedrich Richard Petrie at Fort Martin Scott in Fredericksburg in about 1850. And it's still worn by Comanche women in certain ceremonies today. Here's a photo on the right I took in 1983 of a Comanche scalp dance where the women revived this style of dress for the dance. Chris and I had the honor to present this research to the Comanche tribe. We were invited up and they had a nice dinner for us and we talked about the research, and at the end of the presentation these two ladies came up and said, "Hey, that's us in that picture that you took back in 1983. So it was really a charming moment, and there they are, and they're wearing red and blue too. So, we have one more slide of a more recent group. This group's just a couple years old, and the young women are wearing that style of dress that was first portrayed here in Fredericksburg many years ago. And that's one of the things that Krivitz talks about, among many others. So tremendously rich in detail, historical information about how the Comanches used to live. In conclusion, Berghouse's Comanche study has until now remained largely unappreciated. The first citation of Berghaus in the United States appears in Whipple's 1856 report on Indian languages, where brief mention is made of prior vocabularies. And it seems likely that Whipple came to know of Berghaus through their mutual friend, Alexander von Humboldt. You're probably familiar with the great scientist Humboldt. He had a lot of interesting connections to people here on the frontier. In his notebook on the Comanche language, Albert Gatchett, who I mentioned earlier, wrote down Berghouse's Comanche river names, but didn't make any further comment on them. Pimentel, who I also mentioned, credits E. Krivitz, he spells his name wrong, in an 1875 work where he's also looking at Bushman. In addition to these early authors, only Gatchett in a German publication and my own edited version of another dictionary, the 1865 Garcia-Rayjon vocabulary, among all the subsequent Comanche language publications, only those acknowledge Berghaus. He is not mentioned, as are Bushman and Whipple, in the standard summary of North American language research. The ethnographic detail that Berghaus published is likewise neglected. The earliest standard 20th century history and cultural description of the Comanches do not cite him, nor do any of the numerous more recent Comanche histories and cultural studies. The ethnonyms that Berghaus recorded are generally absent from the foundational synonymies produced by American ethnologists, such as those appearing in Hodge in 1907 and Sturtevant in 2001. In plain English, what we're saying there is that all those sub-names and tribal names that Krivitz wrote down, later anthropologists have tried to compare those and make sense of them as being related to each other, but that information from Krivitz has not been taken up in that effort yet. So, we were very happy to be able to get this work out where it can be more mainstream and inform continuing Comanche studies. So despite this neglect, Berghaus's work is a convergence point for European and American intellectual history, American frontier history, and historical and contemporary American Indian studies. His Comanche article stands as a fascinating illustration of the improbable connections between the Comanche Indians, Texas German settlers, leading intellectuals in Europe, and their counterparts in the burgeoning American community of scholars. Their interactions produced a major advance in linguistic classification and a robust cultural record of the Comanches. And so that concludes the formal part of our talk, and thank you for your attention. I would mention that we also have another book that pursues some other aspects of the German-Comanche relationship in the Fredericksburg area, which will be coming out in November. And it's entitled Comanches, Captives, and Germans. Some of you may have been attending our talk on March 17th at the Pioneer Museum, where we talked about this book. but this book will be coming out also. And together, these two books and some other things that Chris and I are working on, hopefully will shed a lot of light on the unique contributions of the Texas Germans as they relate to the Comanche Indians. So with that, I will invite Chris to join me, and we can take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you all very